The European Parliament is set to vote this week on a resolution condemning Russia's detention of Ukrainian civilians. It's not known how many civilians are being held in prisons and special camps. Estimates range from 10 to 30,000 people. The vote comes a week after a screening of the documentary Prisoners, the System of Terror. It examines a clandestine detention infrastructure in Russian-occupied territories. We have this report now and a warning. It contains distressing images of Ukrainians tortured by Russian forces.
These are Russian detention centers where lawyers and relatives say thousands of Ukrainians are arbitrarily being held, some for years without charges. There are no legal grounds for this, even in the Russian constitution. The film Prisoners, the System of Terror documents cases like Alexandra Tarasov's. He's a Ukrainian activist liberated from captivity after 1 year in jail. He'd been arrested during the Russian occupation of Kherson for supporting Ukraine and distributing humanitarian help. He had no contact with the outside world, his family not knowing whether he was alive or dead.
We, for example, in Detention Centre 1 in Simferopol and Detention Centre 2 were tortured simply for no reason. We were sitting there for 2, 3, 4 months, 6 months, a year. We were no longer of any operational interest. We were taken out every day and had to stand in splits while they used tasers on us. We had a shower once every 2 weeks for 3 minutes in cold water, and the women went through the same.
According to the UN, 91% of Ukrainians in Russian prisons and camps have been subjected to torture. The film's director, Yevgenia Chirikova, presents data about beatings, tasers, burning tattoos, torture by injections, sexualized violence, simulated executions.
There is a system of terror, and the Putin regime have only one goal: to destroy Ukraine and to destroy Ukraine identity.
There are legal mechanisms for exchanging military prisoners of war, but not for rescuing imprisoned civilians. The Geneva Conventions do not cover exchanges of civilians because, according to international law, civilians must not be captured. Right now, only human rights activists and relatives are fighting for their release.
Russia, its state institutions, do not respond at all. We do not know where many of the civilians are, what condition they're in, what's happening to them. That is, they're incommunicado.
Tetiana only knows about her 23-year-old son Domian because his case was made public. Russian authorities put him on trial under fabricated charges, including international terrorism. He's since lost more than 30 kilos in weight, had his teeth knocked out, and suffers from problems with his legs.
The most important thing is to bring them back alive. I'm not saying we'll bring them back healthy, because that's unlikely, but alive.
So far, only around 600 civilians have been rescued from Russian captivity.
The best decision on this situation will be to support the Ukraine army, because I believe that thanks of victory of Ukraine army, it's possible to change Putin regime within Russia. It's our chance to change situation.
Now relatives and activists are hoping the European Parliament will help, but it's unclear how much it can do.
And let's get more on this now. We are joined by Cecilia Helistvite. She is an international law expert and co-authored a report on Ukrainian civilians in arbitrary detention by the Russian Federation. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Does the European Parliament have any leverage to meaningfully change the situation for those civilian prisoners being held by Russia?
Good morning, and thank you for having me on. Now, it doesn't directly influence the situation, but this resolution will certainly increase the political pressure on Russia. And this group of civilian prisoners are really in a very, very poor state because there are no mechanisms for their release, such as for prisoners of war and even for the deported children. So the group of civilian prisoners in Russian hands is really one of the groups of Ukrainians that have been forgotten, so to speak. So that means that this type of political pressure will definitely bring this issue up on the agenda.
And aside from the pressure, I mean, perhaps more broadly speaking, what are the legal instruments in international law to protect civilians in cases like these?
Now, the civilian prisoners who are in the hands of the enemy belligerent, they are one of three groups. You have prisoners of war, you have the civilian prisoners, and then you have the children who are arbitrarily or deported to Russia. Now, the civilians, normally they are protected by the Fourth Geneva Convention. Now, the Fourth Geneva Convention apply in occupied territory. Now, the occupied territory of Ukraine that are currently under Russian control, Russia considers this to be Russian territory. Therefore, Russia does not apply this convention. And this situation has brought these civilians into a black hole, a legal black hole. And they are also kept in what you could consider to be dark places or black detention centers. In occupied territory, but also in other parts of Russia. Normally, information about these people, their numbers, their names, and their whereabouts should be handed over to Ukraine. But since Russia doesn't comply with the system under the Fourth Geneva Convention, their whereabouts is not there, so the entire system of protection that is supposed to apply to them has totally collapsed because Russia doesn't comply.
Let's talk a little bit more about that lack of transparency over the whereabouts of the civilian prisoners. Plus, many of them are just in this limbo, as you've highlighted. How unique is this situation?
Now, this is a situation that we have had over the past 3 or 4 decades in civil wars around the world. Because in civil wars, international law doesn't really provide a good system. The war in Ukraine is different. This is a war, it's a full-scale aggression. There are 2 major countries that are involved, and international law has very clear rules for those situations. The problem is that Russia doesn't have the system in place that it's supposed to have. That means that these people are basically exposed to all types of violations of international law because none of the systems that are supposed to be in place to protect them as victims of war seem to be functioning. It means that they are exposed to torture, they're exposed to conditions of detainment, but they're also exposed to potentially indefinite detainment in black sites, which is really a type of victimhood that we don't really seem to have good instrument for pressuring the Russian belligerent. Now, that means that the type of political pressure that is now getting stronger with the European resolution coming up can potentially increase the pressure on Russia to correct this situation, because these are really true victims of war.
Cecilia Helistvite, thank you so much for joining us to share that expertise.
Alexandra Mvichuk is a human rights lawyer and heads the non-profit organization, the Center for Civil Liberties in Kyiv, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2022. Today, she joins us from Rome in Italy. Now, Alexandra, do you have hope that the resolution by the European Parliament can change anything?
Let me explain why this resolution matters. Recent months, we heard a lot about natural minerals, about Russia's territorial claims, about Putin's vision of Ukrainian history, but we didn't hear about people. We still have no idea what will be with tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians, men and women, as well as prisoners of the war, subjected to horrible torture and sexual abuse daily. We must return human dimension into all political process on the international level. And this resolution of European Parliament provides a right focus to the destinies of human being.
Now, your organization has received thousands of requests to help civilian detainees. How can you actually help?
I found myself, together with my colleagues, in a situation when the law doesn't work. Russia brutally ignored all provisions of international law and all decision of international organizations. But we have no other choice. We have to fight to release Ukrainian people in captivity because they are literally dying. They're going through hell, and it's not a metaphor. I spoke with hundreds of people who survived Russian captivity. They told me how they were beaten, raped, smashed into wooden boxes, their fingers were cut, their nails were torn away, they were electrically shocked through their genitalia. Knowing this, we have a clear understanding that part of these people have a very little chance to be alive till the end of this war. So we have no time. We have to do everything.
Now, last year, your organization presented a strategy for the release of illegally detained civilians. What is that strategy?
Its strategy combines legal and other methods, how to influence to Russia and make pressure to Putin to release illegally detained civilians and prisoners of the war. It's about sanctions, it's about diplomatic efforts, it's about some legal mechanisms. Also, altogether, we need a comprehensive strategy because, as I mentioned before, Russia ignores the law as such.
Now, it is against international law, of course, to detain non-combatants in war, as we've heard, but how can those responsible be held accountable?
We interviewed people who survived Russian captivities, and we collect information about perpetrators. There are a lot of information about this. Some people remember very clearly people who provide this torture, some people not, but still we have a very solid ground for future investigations. International crimes has no statute of limitation. Sooner or later, we will find and identify these people.
Now, as we've heard, Russia, of course, does not seem to care about agreements and international law. Are there any other measures that could be put in place, and what could they be?
Let me mention just several. Is a European Parliament resolution rightly mentioned that we have to increase sanctions against Russia. There are different fields which is still not covered and can make pressure. Also, we have to understand that justice has practical meaning. And we have 300 billion of frozen Russian assets in G7 country, plus Belgium and Germany as well. And these costs are immobilized. We have to use this money for benefits of Ukraine, to use them for recovery, for self-defense, and also for compensations. Because people who return from Russian captivity, they can't wait for reparation for years. They need medical assistance now, psychological assistance now. Russian captivity broke not just body. Russian captivity tried to destroy the personality of every human beings.
Alexandra Mvichuk there. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you.